Today's theme is 15 years since the accident of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. Achievements and future challenges of remediation. Let's get started. Well, everyone, March 11, 2026, will mark the 15th anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake. In this disaster, the accident of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station caused radioactive materials to spread into the environment, resulting in serious environmental contamination, and a number of people were forced to evacuate. However, after that, relevant legal systems were put in place, and remediation was implemented over a wide range of regions in eastern Japan, resulting in the lifting of the evacuation orders in many areas, and the return of people's livelihoods. Of course, for the reconstruction of the affected areas, it is required for issues from a lot of perspectives to be addressed, not only from radiation, but also aging population, revitalizing regional industries, and rebuilding communities and so forth. In this video, however, I will talk about issues on radiation, especially focusing on remediation activities. Specifically, I will explain the achievements made over the past 15 years, as well as future challenges, including environmental contamination immediately after the accident, the designation of evacuation areas, progress and achievements in remediation, the lifting of evacuation orders, interim storage and recycling of soil generated through remediation, and international assessments of these projects. As a result of the accident of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, a lot of radioactive materials, including iodine-131, cesium-134, cesium-137 were released into the environment. In principle, more radioactive materials were deposited into places closer to the nuclear power station, but the contamination level totally varied, depending on conditions, such as wind direction, rainfalls, and topography after the accident. Especially, in the areas around the nuclear power station, and in the northwest regions, air dose rate became high, and in these areas, residents were forced to evacuate immediately after the accident. Although contamination level varied from place to place, the spread of radioactive materials was not limited to Fukushima Prefecture, but also spread to Miyagi and Iwata Prefectures in Tohoku region, and Ibaraki and Chiba Prefectures in Kanto region, where remediation was carried out. Immediately after the accident, the national government had designated evacuation areas in the regions where it recognized necessity of emergency evacuation. Within a couple of days after the disaster, the evacuation areas had been gradually expanded, and the areas within 20 kilometers from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station were designated as the evacuation areas, and all residents in the areas were ordered to evacuate. After that, areas outside the 20 kilometers radius, where the annual dose could possibly exceed 20 millisieverts, were designated as a deliberate evacuation areas, and evacuation within 1 month was recommended. Further to that, in addition to those areas, the areas between 20 kilometers and 30 kilometers from the nuclear power station were designated as evacuation preparation areas in case of emergency, and the evacuation of children and pregnant women was mainly recommended. Moreover, spots where dose could possibly be locally high were designated as specific spots recommended for evacuation, and the necessary support for evacuation was provided. After that, the evacuation areas were recategorized into 3 areas, namely, restricted areas, habitation restricted areas, and preparation areas for lift of evacuation order, which formed the basis for the subsequent reconstruction plan. Details will be explained later, but after the accident, the full-scale remediation started in January 2012, when the Act on Special Measures Concerning the Handling of Environment Pollution by Radioactive Materials fully took effect. Before that, remediation activities had been conducted mainly in public places, and places used by children, such as schools and parks, as model projects by relevant ministries and agencies, and as pilot projects by national research institutes and municipalities. Especially, at that time, each municipality conducted small-scale remediation activities, sometimes with the help of experts and volunteers, despite having insufficient human resources and budgets. The impact of the accident spread across a wide range of areas, and it required the establishment of a necessary legal framework as soon as possible to implement systematic remediation. Therefore, the Act on Special Measures Concerning the Handling of Environment Pollution by Radioactive Materials was promulgated in August 2011, and after the basic policy was established in November, it came into full effect in January 2012. This framework systematized measures for environmental restoration, including remediation, such as role sharing between the national and local governments, monitoring systems, approaches to waste treatment, the development process for remediation implementation plans, and cost sharing, thereby forming the basis for subsequent full-scale projects. In the Act on Special Measures Concerning the Handling of Environment Pollution by Radioactive Materials, one of the core mechanisms is the establishment of two areas, that is, Special Decontamination Area and Intensive Contamination Survey Area. The Special Decontamination Areas are the areas based on the evacuation areas after the recategorization that I explained just earlier, and the areas where the national government has directly implemented remediation activities. There are various opinions regarding the national government, particularly the Ministry of the Environment, having implemented the remediation activities. However, this decision took into consideration factors, such as the fact that the administrative functions of municipalities had to evacuate due to evacuation orders, that the affected areas were too large for the Tokyo Electric Power Company, which bears primary responsibility for the accident, to carry out the remediation, and that the national government had social responsibility, as the promoter of nuclear policy. Initially, 11 municipalities near the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station were designated as the special decontamination areas. However, the number has since decreased to 10 following the lifting of the evacuation order for Tomoe City in March 2022. On the other hand, the intensive contamination survey areas are areas where mainly the local municipalities had implemented remediation, with the technical and financial supports of the national government. At maximum 104 municipalities in 8 prefectures, including Fukushima Prefecture, were designated, but after that, air dose rate decreased due to the progress of remediation and natural decay, and the number of the designated municipalities is currently 64. From January 2012 onward, remediation activities have been implemented in 8 prefectures in eastern Japan, based on the Act on Special Measures Concerning the Handling of Environmental Pollution by Radioactive Materials. Remediation methods were diverse, and a variety of methods were applied, depending on characteristics and contamination level of the sites, including surface wiping, high-pressure water washing, removal of topsoil, plowing, removal of fallen leaves, removal of sediment from drainage ditches, and asphalt scraping. In the special decontamination areas, excluding the restricted areas, full-scale remediation activities were completed in March 2017, mainly by the Ministry of the Environment, with the cooperation of relevant stakeholders. Remediation was completed on approximately 23,000 residential properties, 8,700 hectares of farmland, 7,800 hectares of forest, and 1,500 hectares of roads. On the other hand, in the intensive contamination survey areas, facilities related to children, such as schools and parks, as well as facilities used by the general public, were prioritized for remediation, as remediation was implemented, while residents continued to live in these areas. These efforts resulted in the completion of full-scale remediation activities in March 2018, in all municipalities within the intensive contamination survey areas. remediation was completed on approximately 570,000 residential properties, 24,000 public facilities, 33,000 hectares of farmland and pasture, 4,800 hectares of forest, and 24,000 kilometers of roads. After these remediation, necessary monitoring and follow-up remediation were conducted. This will be discussed later. However, in the restricted areas, remediation has continued to be implemented, although on a smaller scale than before. The approach for treating removed soil and waste generated by remediation is significantly different inside and outside Fukushima Prefecture. Within Fukushima Prefecture, removed soil and waste have been primarily transported to the temporary storage sites constructed in each region, and then further transported to the interim storage facility, which will be explained later. By the way, within Fukushima Prefecture, a total of more than 1,300 temporary storage sites were constructed with the cooperation of local communities. However, in cases where the construction of temporary storage sites was delayed, or where it was difficult to construct such sites, mainly in urban areas, removed soil and waste were temporarily stored on site, at a total of approximately 190,000 remediated sites. Removed soil and waste that had been stored at temporary storage sites and on-site storage sites were eventually transported to the interim storage facility. As of September 2025, the number of temporary storage sites and on-site storage sites had decreased to 10 and 550, respectively. After their use, many temporary storage sites were returned to landowners and, for example, used again as farmland. By the way, the amount of removed soil and waste, which had been transported to the interim storage facility, was more than 14 million cubic meters as of November 2025. On the other hand, in 7 prefectures other than Fukushima Prefecture, facilities equivalent to the interim storage facility, where removed soil and waste generated within each prefecture would be stored collectively, were not constructed. Instead, removed soil and waste have continued to be stored at temporary storage sites and on-site storage sites, as explained earlier. As of March 2025, the number of temporary storage sites and on-site storage sites is approximately 45 and 31,000, respectively, and the amount of removed soil and waste stored is approximately 470,000 cubic meters. Here, I would like to briefly explain the interim storage facility. The interim storage facility straddles Okuma Town and Futaba Town, and it was constructed around the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. It covers approximately 1,600 hectares, which is almost the same size as Shibuya City in Tokyo. To put it simply, the interim storage facility is the facility to treat the removed soil and part of waste, generated through remediation activities in Fukushima Prefecture, and to temporarily store the treated soil and waste. The interim storage facility began operations in March 2015, and transport volumes to the facility peaked in fiscal years 2019 and 2020, during which approximately 4 million cubic meters of soil and waste were transported annually. Remediation activities have continued to date in the restricted areas, and transportation projects have continued, although transport volumes have decreased to 10% or less of the peak level. Importantly, as the name suggests, this facility serves only for an intermediate storage, and the final disposal of the stored soil and waste is to be completed outside Fukushima Prefecture by March 2045, in accordance with the law. More than 80% of the land of the interim storage facility has been secured by the national government through land purchases or the establishment of long-term surface rights. However, the facilities within the premises of the interim storage facility were constructed on land where approximately 2,700 people lived before the accident. Therefore, it is important to recognize that this project is based on the very difficult decision made by local residents to provide the lands that had been inherited from their ancestors. Since immediately after the accident, air dose rates have been monitored over a wide range of areas, including Fukushima Prefecture, through airborne and ground-based monitoring. Overall, air dose rates have decreased significantly due to the physical decay of radioactive materials over time, as well as natural attenuation caused by the effects of wind and rain. This clear change is confirmed by the results of airborne monitoring. When comparing the results as of June 2012, approximately 1 year and 3 months after the accident, with those as of December 2024, approximately 13 years and 9 months after the accident, the red and yellow areas, indicating high radiation levels, clearly decreased, while the dark blue areas, indicating low radiation levels, increased. Furthermore, in the living areas, air dose rates decreased as a result of remediation activities, although the areas were limited, compared with entire eastern Japan. For example, the national government published data showing that, in the special decontamination areas, air dose rates decreased as a result of remediation by 60% in residential areas, 59% in farmlands, 30% in forests, and 44% on roads, respectively. The rate of physical decay varies among different radionuclides, and at present, the radionuclide that remains in the environment and has an impact is cesium-137, which has a half-life of approximately 30 years. Air dose rate will continue to decrease, but the decrease rate will gradually slow down. I think that measures from a long-term perspective to address radiation issues, such as continuous monitoring, remain necessary. As explained earlier, the evacuation areas designated immediately after the accident were recategorized in a step-by-step manner into restricted areas, habitation restricted areas, and preparation areas for the lift of evacuation order by August 2013. Afterward, due to reductions in air dose rates, as explained earlier, and the development of necessary infrastructure, the evacuation orders that were issued immediately after the accident have been lifted in a step-by-step manner. Specifically, the lifting of evacuation orders began in April 2014 in Tomoe City, and all evacuation orders, except for those in the restricted areas, were lifted by March 2020. After that, within the restricted areas, development of the specified reconstruction and revitalization base areas began, enabling residents to return and live there, through integrated remediation and infrastructure development, implemented by the national government. From June 2022 onward, the development of the specified reconstruction and revitalization base areas were progressively completed, and by November 2023, all evacuation orders had been lifted as planned. Furthermore, from December 2023 onward, within the same restricted areas, development of the specified living areas for returnees began, over the course of the 2020s, enabling people who wish to return to live there. In areas where evacuation orders were lifted, although challenges remain to be addressed, the living environment has been improved, and systems have been put in place to enable people to return to the areas, through the resumption of education, medical services, and commercial facilities, as well as by attracting new industries. As explained so far, remediation activities started shortly after the accident and made significant progress. However, they also resulted in the generation of large amounts of soil and waste. Of this soil and waste, flammable waste, such as grass, leaves, and branches has been incinerated at existing or temporary incineration facilities, and the resulting ash is currently stored at storage facilities on the premises of the interim storage facility. Furthermore, this is a different project from remediation. However, for debris generated by the tsunami, and waste generated by demolishing houses, safe treatment has been promoted through the construction of necessary disposal facilities, while implementing material recycling. On the other hand, the amount of soil generated is particularly significant, and a variety of approaches have been adopted for its treatment. As explained earlier, the removed soil generated within Fukushima Prefecture is managed in a centralized manner at the interim storage facility. However, it is stipulated by law that the soil is supposed to be finally disposed of outside Fukushima Prefecture within 30 years after the start of interim storage, that is, by March 2045. The national government has promoted measures to utilize removed soil with low radioactivity concentrations, designated as a reconstruction recycling soil, in order to reduce the volume requiring final disposal, because it considers it extremely difficult to secure final disposal sites outside Fukushima Prefecture for such a large volume of soil. So far, its safety has been confirmed through pilot projects involving the embankment of farmlands and roads, using soil generated through remediation. Basic technical development was completed by March 2025, including other pilot projects, and the achievements were compiled as the guideline for the utilization of reconstruction recycling soil. In addition, since July 2025, projects utilizing soil arising from remediation have been implemented on the premises of the Prime Minister's official residence, as well as at relevant ministries and agencies. This indicates that full-scale recycling projects for removed soil have begun, although their scale still remains limited. The national government has promoted these efforts by gaining public understanding, while less than 20 years remain until the deadline for the final disposal. Remediation efforts in Japan are the first large-scale projects of their kind in the world, aimed at enabling the return of the public after an accident of a nuclear power station. Therefore, they have attracted keen attention from the international community since shortly after the accident. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which promotes the peaceful use of nuclear power, has provided advice on Japan's efforts by dispatching a mission in 2011, followed by a follow-up mission in 2013. In addition, the IAEA held for international expert meetings on remediation activities in 2016 and 2017, and published a report in 2023. Moreover, in 2023 and 2024, the IAEA held 3 expert meetings on recycling of removed soil arising from remediation activities, and published a report in September 2024. In this report, it is evaluated that the team of experts concluded that the approach and activities implemented by the MOEJ to date for the managed recycling and the final disposal of removed soil and waste are consistent with the IAEA safety standards. Continuous support has been provided by the IAEA, for example, its follow-up meetings are scheduled to be held in the future. In addition, Japan has continuously disseminated its experience, gained through remediation since shortly after the accident, not only through the IAEA, but also through bilateral meetings and conferences with other international organizations and bodies, such as the ICRP and the OECD. Around the world, there are a number of regions contaminated with radioactive materials, where environmental restoration projects have been implemented, such as former uranium mining sites. I hope that Japan will learn from these cases around the world, and use them as references in determining its future direction, while continuing to disseminate its own efforts. As explained so far, remediation activities have contributed to environmental restoration and regional reconstruction in Fukushima over the 15 years since the accident of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. The areas affected by remediation activities are limited when compared with the physical decay of radioactive materials and with the effects of natural attenuation caused by wind and rain. However, these activities have steadily reduced radiation levels in living areas where they were implemented and have contributed to the return of residents. Further to this, with regard to the soil and waste generated through remediation activities, land necessary for temporary storage sites has been secured in cooperation with local communities, and the soil and waste have been safely managed before being transported to subsequent destinations. After use, the land has been basically restored to its original condition and returned to the landowners. At the same time, waste generated by the tsunami and by the demolition of houses, which constitutes a project separate from remediation, has been safely treated through measures, such as securing and developing necessary final disposal facilities, while also implementing recycling. In conjunction with progress in the reconstruction of other infrastructure, all evacuation orders, except those in the restricted areas, have now been lifted. Even in the restricted areas, evacuation orders have been partially lifted in a step-by-step manner, which has steadily contributed to the reconstruction of people's lives. Over the 15 years of large-scale remediation activities following the accident, the first effort of its kind in the world, aimed at enabling public return, a substantial body of knowledge has been accumulated and shared both domestically and internationally. These efforts have been undertaken with advice from the international community, particularly the IAEA, and have received a certain level of recognition. Going forward, it is expected that efforts will continue to be advanced in cooperation with the international community. As explained so far, reconstruction in Fukushima has made significant progress over the past 15 years. However, there are still challenges that need to be addressed in relation to the issues discussed earlier. The first challenge is measures in the restricted areas. As explained earlier, even within the restricted areas, remediation has been carried out in the specified reconstruction and revitalization base areas, and the specified living areas for returnees, leading to the lifting of evacuation orders. If evacuation orders are lifted in all currently planned areas, approximately 70% would be covered on a population basis. However, more than 80% would remain designated as the restricted areas, in terms of land area. The areas that will remain designated as the restricted areas include extensive forested land, and it is not realistic to implement remediation in all such areas. Nevertheless, while necessary remediation should continue, further discussion is required on how these remaining areas should be managed from a long-term perspective and how evacuation orders can be lifted while gaining the understanding of local communities. The second challenge is the treatment of soil and waste generated by remediation activities. Within Fukushima Prefecture, a significant amount of soil and waste, stored at the interim storage facility, is to be finally disposed of outside Fukushima Prefecture by March 2045. Efforts are currently underway to reduce the volume. However, at this stage, it cannot yet be said that these initiatives have gained nationwide momentum. Technical verification for the recycling projects has been conducted through pilot projects. However, nationwide rollout of these efforts requires public understanding of the need for the projects, as well as understanding of the potential impacts of radiation exposure. These efforts need to be advanced in a step-by-step manner. In prefectures other than Fukushima Prefecture, a substantial volume of soil is still temporarily stored at remediation sites and temporary storage sites. Going forward, it will be necessary to ensure that such soil is appropriately disposed of, in accordance with the standards published in March 2025. Finally, as the third challenge, I would like to highlight the transfer of technology and knowledge. 15 years have passed since the disaster, and we have now entered a period in which junior high school students and younger generations have no direct experience of it. Globally, electricity generation from nuclear power is expected to increase in response to growing electricity demand and the need to address climate change. Needless to say, preventing such an accident from ever occurring again is of the utmost importance. At the same time, however, in the unlikely event that such an accident were to occur, it is essential to ensure thorough preparedness nationwide, drawing on the experience gained over the past 15 years. In addition, sharing the technologies and knowledge accumulated to date with the international community so that they may be utilized in the event of similar incidents constitutes an important international contribution that Japan can make. From the perspective of post-disaster reconstruction, there are many other important challenges. However, with regard to remediation in particular, as progress has been made, the phase of large-scale remediation and transportation has largely come to an end, and the focus is now gradually shifting to the treatment and disposal of substantial volumes of soil and waste. Nevertheless, as these challenges deal with radiation, which is not able to be perceived through the human senses, efforts to promote accurate understanding must continue without end. In order to achieve further progress, each of us must take ownership of these challenges. To that end, I will continue to make every effort. Focusing mainly on remediation efforts, I have reviewed the achievements to date and the challenges ahead. I hope this overview has been helpful for you. At the outset, there was no institutional framework designed to address an unprecedented nuclear disaster, such as the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, in which substantial amounts of radioactive materials were released into the environment. The project was therefore carried out in uncharted territory by all those involved. Nevertheless, through the dedicated efforts and cooperation of many stakeholders, it has steadily achieved meaningful results. However, it is also true that many challenges still remain. Over the next 5 to 10 years, this channel will continue to share knowledge and information on radiation and remediation in an accessible manner, with the aim of further supporting the reconstruction of the affected areas. Thank you for watching this video. Okay, that's all for today. See you in the next video.